Hi, Bob. How are
Hi,
you?
Talia. Good.
Good to
You?
see you.
Good to see you.
Thanks for joining me today.
Pleasure.
All right, let's kick it off. Bob, introduce yourself. Tell us the amazing things you've accomplished in your life.
I raised two lovely daughters. I have a beautiful wife. Those would be probably number one.
That's the right answer,
I'm
Bob.
not sure what you meant. I'm not sure you meant that, but
Well, that's the right
knowing you, you
answer.
probably
That's
did.
the first and most important thing.
Yes. So I think the relevant part is I've spent the last 25 years in B2B software, particularly in networks, marketplaces, payments, places where there are many buyers and many suppliers interacting. The first one was the Ariba network, which was my responsibility for about 10 years. And then I ran a company called Service Channel, was president of that, that had a similar configuration, connecting buyers and suppliers. In that case, it was owners of real estate with subcontractors. So, and that between those two experiences, I decided to sort of stay in that type of business, AP, AR, finance, payments, procurement, accounts receivable, all in B2B. And I think probably must be now 15 years ago I met you and
Yeah,
was honored to serve on your board for many years. And so that's the background.
amazing. All right, well, we're here to talk about fraud. I know even though you did a lot with suppliers and networks, but you've definitely dove in quite a bit on the payment side of things in the last number of years.
Absolutely.
And I think it's really fascinating. I think fraud has always been an issue, but I think it's exasperated now. And so let's start. I really want to see what you've seen change in fraud in the recent years, and especially in industries like entertainment and production finance.
Yeah, so let's start broadly. Technology is both it can be used as a defensive weapon and an offensive weapon by the fraudster. So, I'm old enough to remember the days when B2B commerce was all, uh, at best email, um, and often paper and fax, right? And when you look at the technology has made it both easier to, in theory, to monitor fraud, but much easier for the fraudsters to commit the types of fraudulent acts that they have always loved to do, whether it's creating a false entity in a vendor master or submitting duplicate invoices or a whole variety of techniques all have been made much, much easier with the advent of technology and supercharged with generative AI, obviously. I think so that's sort of broadly the the history and the scope. What's so interesting about entertainment production is that, as you well know, these productions are sort of independent businesses slash projects that are set up very rapidly. They have to execute very rapidly, and they involve lots of new vendors by definition, which is all of the opposite of everything you want to do to protect yourself against fraud. So it's like it's a business whose characteristics make it the most vulnerable to fraud possible. And therefore, you have to be just super extra vigilant. And people have tried a number of techniques to to solve that, and we can talk about that. But I think it's the combination of the nature of the business and the rise of the nature of the business and the rise of the potential to commit fraud that is like a potentially toxic mixture unless you're very careful.
Yeah, and you think about, so because of the unique attributes of production and entertainment industry, creative industries, right? It's with live events as well. They need to move so much faster. It needs to be much more flexible.
In the
The
field,
legacy, right?
yeah,
The legacy systems don't work, right? And the legacy systems were built to really protect the company, as one of the things against fraud. And so, really, when you're going off those systems, now you're doing manual processes, right? And so, now you've got, and I love what you said, it is these are industries that are at highest risk for fraud, yet the processes within those organizations in these industries are the weakest against fraud. So you just set yourself up for like the highest risk possible. And the
Absolutely.
reason for that is these many of these processes are all done on email. You've got, first of all, I think there's a combination of things. Number one, you're often hiring third party individuals as accountants or event planners or whatnot, that are coming in and working just on your event or just on your production, and then they're gone. So that's number one. So there's always risk in that. The second is that the way in which they're gathering the information from the vendors, let's say they're using, ACH with the bank, they're typically getting information over email, bank accounts over email. They're getting invoices to process over email. They're routing approvals over email. They're sending W-9 forms, which have, if you're using, if you're an individual and they're, then their EIN number, their tax ID numbers, their social security number. And so that's going over email. So there's this huge risk. Let's just start with like the risk of sending things over email is like the sophistication of what especially AI has brought to be able to hack that information, to be able to easily, change that information in ways that like you could be so easily fooled, creating email change that looks like somebody approved it. They
Absolutely.
can literally find out everyone who's on the show, all the different roles that they have, and create an email chain that looks like you had the 4 approvals that you needed, and then goes to the accountant and says, pay this, $30,000 invoice. And the approvals are all look like they're there because that's how sophisticated it is. And so to me, like that's for sure one of the biggest risks. And then we could go into like, some of the other ones, but that's where I see huge, like it's not even like, to me, the contemplating continuing to do that on email is just huge exposure.
Yeah, I mean, business email compromise is the number one source of fraud by far. It's not the only one, but it's the number. We'll talk about the vendor master later, but business email compromise is rampant. And to your point, now it is extraordinary the information that can be gathered to make it look real. I'm ashamed. I mean, I'm on the boards of several corporations, consult to several, and I'm constantly. Many of them have, spear phishing type examples to keep me trained as a board member. And first of all, I would say many of the boards I've been on and companies I've been associated with have had problems, and they rise to the level of board scrutiny. So I hear about them, but also I'm tested to see if and I consider myself a fairly sophisticated user, and I've fallen for a few. I'm ashamed to say I've fallen for a few of these attempts, and then I have to take remedial training, which makes it even worse because now it takes time.
And then you
And
have
it's
to go to
and it's
traffic school.
but it's because they've gotten so sophisticated. Anybody knows, to look at where the email, anybody who's careful knows to look at the source of the email. But to your point, Talia, the context that they've been able to develop to pull in data from LinkedIn or from wherever, or from speeches or wherever, to make it look like it's so real that you can't believe, you almost can't resist it, like you're going to get in trouble if you don't do what the
It's
email
exactly right. It's
says.
like that's where
It's
I call like
frightening.
the almost that's like the external fraud, right? Like
Yes.
the parties internal are innocent. They are, hey, these are the 4 people you have to get an approval from. It comes over email, and you get your approval, then you can make your payment. Like that, and they're following protocol, but because the system is in place, it lacks so much security, like email. So to me, if I were to like say, and I don't know what your suggestion is, we're going to go through a number of different areas where there's exposure to fraud, but to me, the number one thing is like you cannot have payment requests and approvals for payments over email. Like to me, like
And
that's
and onboarding and vendor onboarding,
right.
right?
So that will go to
Yeah.
the next one, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so that's
But yeah,
so
payment.
payment
Yes.
requests and approvals. on email is like, to me, like the largest exposure. Like, we do a fraud assessment now, that we do a free fraud assessment for anybody who wants to us to look at their processes and score where they benchmark to their, other peers. And if you're still doing a payments over email, approvals and requests over email, like, that's one of like the lowest scores, because it's the biggest risk. So now let's move to
Absolutely.
vendor onboarding on email as well, which I was sort of talking about. The bank information comes over,
Exactly.
and
EIN.
the
Yeah.
EIN numbers come over, and there's just a huge risk that someone could tap in, right? Can take your inbox. They, then, and they could change the bank information there, or they could steal, right? So there's two parts to it. One is that they could steal that information, and you're responsible, because your supply, if there's like someone gets into your inbox and sees all this bank information along with social security numbers, and you're susceptible to that and responsible for that if that goes on the black market, right? That's one. And then the second is that fraud to your own production or your own event, where somebody gets it, they change it within the email and resend it to you, or change it within your inbox. Like, people don't even realize that's possible.
Yeah, it's possible, and I've been involved in. I've been on boards where it's happened, in companies, and I would say, I do some consulting, and you'd be shocked. I'm often dealing with payments companies. They'll hire me to consult to them, and what will I get? An email and a form asking for all this information. And I'm thinking to myself, really? This is how we're going to do this, right? Now, some have gone to phone verification, which is really interesting, but also now, as you know, can be easily
Well, if you
faked.
put on the form a phone number that's the fraudster's own phone number, they're going to verify that it's correct. People,
Right.
the
And that,
accountants
and
probably
anybody
don't
can
know
take
the
a video.
supplier.
Anybody can take this video after we're done with it, and my voice, and make it say anything they want
Exactly,
for very little money.
exactly.
So yes, it's yeah. You need to. Well, I think you need to make it much more secure. You need to put the onus on the supplier. Give them a ton of security though, to make sure that they're not hacked and the system is not hacked, because most companies are not set up to gather and maintain and collect this information and avoid improper changes. They don't have um, the skills, nor is it their primary goal, right? Your clients are trying to make great creative work, not create a vendor management portal and tool for their one-time vendors, which is what's going to happen,
And
right?
it's the accountants that, right? So if they're collecting it, and if they're storing it in, like, receiving it and uploading it into, let's just say, like a box or Dropbox or something like that, but it's still like within their computer. If that got compromised, and a fraudster was able to get into the email of one of the accountants, or got into the computer of one of the accountants and got access to all these bank accounts and all of these social security numbers, what's the liability? Like, what's the exposure on the film, besides the PR exposure, which would be really
Yeah.
terrible, besides those vendors who would not want to work with them again? But what's the responsibility and the risk, do you know, to, to the actual production, if that information was stolen from them? I think they go to see, did you have best practices, right? Like,
Absolutely.
if you had best practices, but if you don't have best practices, then you're liable, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I would assume, my experience with is that everybody has insurance, and then, but before you get to any insurance payouts, there's all sorts of legal wrangling, right, about whether you did all the things that are required in order to safeguard the information. Your insurance company doesn't want to make a payout, right? Neither does the other insurance company. And it's all based on whether you did your due diligence and showed the proper care and protection of that information, right? And to your point, used best practices of levels of security and division of labor and responsibility, because you're not going to, if you show negligence, you're not going to get any sort of payout, right?
And I
So
also wonder if your insurance, this is something interesting. I'm actually going to look into it after. If you have certain like software or protocols or processes in place that are proactive to make sure that you're doing your best in fraud, versus not and you're lax, is your insurance premium potentially different pricing. So it could be a cost savings potentially to implement the proper protocols in place, even if there's a cost to the protocol, the reduction in the cost of insurance, plus obviously the risk. You can't afford that. One email can cost, hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's not worth it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not the world's expert in insurance, but I've been involved in enough insurance claims in enough lines of business to learn that you get whether it's fire for having smoke alarms and carbon monoxide detectors and alarm systems, or it's insurance for having good worker training and safety programs for workers' comp claims. All of those lower your premiums. And also, I've learned a million times that there are very high deductibles on these policies. And there are ways for the insurance companies to get out. And you want to do everything you can to avoid the claim to begin with, because it's going to be expensive no matter what. Even if you
Yeah.
have insurance, it's going to be expensive. It always is. And you're going to end up in a lawsuit, right?
Super interesting. So
Yeah.
let's move to now we're on to our next part of fraud, which is internal, right? So
Well,
the
yeah.
processes and I believe that there was an article, I believe it was in the Wall Street Journal last year, that the DOJ went after an accountant who had, I guess, stolen millions of dollars from multiple productions by creating kind of fake accounts, and the protocols were not in place to have the proper visibility and security. I think it was, it looked like it was more email approvals and other things that went on. And it was pretty late by the time that was caught. And I imagine, unfortunately, that goes on more often. So let's talk about kind of the internal fraud that is risky if you don't have the proper protocols and how you could avoid that.
Yeah. I mean, now you're at a whole different level of problem. And what's so sad is that it's so easy if all it takes is one person. If you're not properly structured with both business processes and technology for fraud to be committed, right? It's very easy um, for someone to misuse cards, for instance, as you know, and there's been a million cases of that. It's also, if you don't have the control of the vendor master is so important, right? If you can set up, anybody who has the power to set up a vendor on the inside who wants to commit fraud, if there's not separation of duties, you're going to have problems. And that the reason you do separation of duties is to make fraud less likely. Now you have to have two people, right, in on the internal, in on the fraud. But even, that's harder than one person, but you just have to be super careful in anybody who can set up a supplier to be paid, because now you have the power to both approve invoices that are fraudulent and to make payments that are you can make the invoice look, to your point, you can make the invoice look valid. The supplier could even be valid, but as long as the payment is going to somewhere that's not attached to that vendor, right, now you've got fraud. I mean, there's so many levels of fraud that you can commit if you have someone on the inside who's intent on it. And so all you can do is have people, process, and technology. It's trite, but it's true, to try to protect yourself against that. But now you're at a whole different level when you have someone on the inside.
So, so let's talk about that, Bob. What is, like, we talked about kind of the problems, and you just mentioned, like, so people, process, technology, like, what are the best practices that can be implemented, especially, like, obviously in general, but in the creative industries, like, it's like when you are going off of your legacy system, your main ERP that really protects you, and now you're going, you have to move faster, you have to do things differently. How do you continue to protect yourself with, people, process, and technology?
Well, I mean, there are a myriad of answers. Obviously, one of the things that's happening now is you try to use data, right? You can check, when things are changed, you can check the change, you can route it, you can have workflow, you can check against external sources of data. When you set up vendors, you can be much more careful if you have data you bring to bear. In your case, for instance, you have a network, right? So a certain percentage of the vendors that's a new production is going to set up are already on your system and set up, right? So you're verifying once, and that's a there's a cost to that, but you're verifying once. At least you're verifying it once across a whole bunch of different productions,
Right.
right? So
And
you're
then
not
you're reducing that risk because that's actually
yeah,
really true. I haven't even thought about it as if there's a vendor already, let's say, and for the example of Eved, that they're already in the Eved Pay network and they've already been paid by other people,
exactly.
you know already that that's like all verified.
Much lower risk,
Right.
right?
That's
Much
true.
lower risk.
And that's almost
Um,
like on our part because we take that responsibility, right? When we wind up bringing on a supplier, we into the EvidPay network, they go through that rigorous process that we to verify that they are who they are, that they say, and even and when they change things, right, we're making sure that it's all like there's a whole bunch of security measures to make sure that that's changed. Now the AI opportunity that we see is you were just talking about, oh, you can tell if something changes, right? But if you're manually doing this, they don't have time or cost, like the resources to be able to watch all that carefully. Where I think it's really interesting when it's in a software system, like a centralized system where the entire process is happening, then you can deploy AI to be watching that all on a mass scale and then being able to bring it to you, to a human when necessary, because you can see that. And that's what like some of the stuff like we've deployed, which is super cool.
yeah, I mean, the other thing we could talk about, and the industry pushes the use of the virtual card, the single-use virtual card, which certainly has benefits because it can be tied to a certain amount and a certain vendor. So there's no doubt that it's better than a plastic card or a card on file, but it still has limitations because, as you know, many of the suppliers don't want to accept it, right?
Right. They don't
Right.
want to accept it, and also it could still be a card that got it. You could send that card to the wrong
The
email.
card usually
Someone
gets
gets the
emailed.
email address,
I was
and
just going to
there's
say, the number usually gets emailed, and now you have a bit of a problem, right? So,
yeah.
yeah, so it's
Like
not,
they can't steal a number. Someone can't steal a number after it's been used, but they certainly can steal the initial email that sent the number to that vendor, and the wrong vendor can charge it. So you
yeah,
still have a lot of high risk there.
yeah. But I think at the end of the day, I mean, we touched on it quickly. I think this is why some of the most successful, um, you know, B2B payment solutions end up being like Aved, sort of a vertical network, is because you're able to take that entity, that supplier entity who's dealing with a bunch of different productions and studios, and keep track of it and verify it and see its business and its validity across all these different entities. Makes it so much better. Now that doesn't mean you're always adding new
Right.
suppliers, but at least when you do all that verification, it brings comfort to the next production as well, right?
Yeah.
They don't have to recreate everything, right? They have to create the connection, but they don't have to verify that it's an entity.
The other thing I think I want to touch on is just like approval matrices, because I think also when they're too complex and too unnecessary, right? When somebody gets notifications that they don't actually need to approve,
Yeah,
we just let them stack up. So when the real things
yeah,
come through, they're ignoring it. So there's like
yes,
fatigue, approval fatigue, I think they call it.
yes,
And that's when a system isn't flexible enough, right, to
agreed.
be able to be configured for exactly what you need. And they're just very much in the box configuration. And then you're forced to kind of send everything, right? So, for example, you really only want to send your highest level if it's over 500,000. I'm just giving an example.
Exactly.
But you
Yeah.
can't configure it that way. So that person gets even the $5 or the $10 ones, and they're just told you don't need to approve those, but they're all filling their box. So then when something comes through that's higher, they're not even looking at it. So to me, like that, it's so like there's a real there's a real loss, right, when you are not having the sophistication of the proper approval matrix within your software in that sense. And if it's also too simple, in which you just say, okay, I have to choose between, over or under, right? If over, then everyone gets it, and if under, okay, we'll just. But and then if it's not set up properly and there's not enough control in it, now you're also risk, like you said, in terms of people could be in on it together, and you might not get the right approvals and things could fall through the cracks.
And sometimes you have to, based on the nature of the expenditure, you have to route it to someone different, right?
Right.
Even different from the amount. But what type of expenditure? Is it for craft services or is it for AV equipment or is it ground transport? It's got to go to someone different who really knows whether it's a legitimate item or not, and whether it meets the contract and whether the service was delivered on time. And so the system has to be sophisticated enough. And you're absolutely right. For many years, many of these systems were very simple rules-based system. They might only have, dollar amount maybe and commodity, right? And to your point, they were either the tolerances were set too low or too high, and people just started ignoring them, right? Or micromanaging them. And with the technology now and with the use of AI, you can really sort of pinpoint what transactions look like they could be fraudulent, and even short of that, who do they have to go to and why, and make sure that the right person is only seeing the right approval. Same is true. It's even worse in vendor onboarding, right? I mean, vendor onboarding was designed to basically make it impossible to onboard a vendor. That's what the idea was from procurement, because you could never, the idea wasn't in these big corporations to make it easy to spend money. It was quite the opposite, right? But you can't do that. First of all companies are realizing you can't do that to highly professional people, make it impossible for them to add vendors that they need to do good work. And that's especially true in creative industries,
Right.
right? So now you have this whole trend towards intake and procurement orchestration and vendor onboarding that are much more flexible and fast to meet the needs of the business, right? And nowhere is that need higher than in the types of businesses you're supporting, right? That are trying to make creative work happen quickly in locations all around the world, right?
Yeah, I remember
So
when we had one very large Fortune 500 client that I think we started that we're just like our 10-year anniversary with them, and I remember one of the requirements in order for this for us to get the contract was to build a pretty sophisticated matrix. Like they have SAP, and they wanted the complexity and the strength of the SAP approval system, but they wanted us to improve it in the sense that it would be a lot more flexible so that they didn't have to send things to people that didn't need to see them, and then so they wouldn't have the fatigue. And it actually was very hard to build. Like it wasn't so simple. It took time. It was complicated to build, which is why a lot of softwares don't have it. But the result of it has been like one of the favorite things that our clients really like, is because they're so used to other systems where, wait, I got to choose either I'm going to have to add a whole bunch of people to get the control or I have to reduce it. And it's like, no, you could literally get down to this category, these price
exactly.
levels, these people in different divisions. So I actually think that that's super important. What do you think will define the next generation of fraud prevention? Like what's coming and what's next?
I think we're hitting on it. It's gonna be so all great applications these days are combining. You have the conventional SaaS sort of workflow, but now you're combining AI with it to learn and see the patterns, but also pulling in external data sources,
Yeah.
whether it's from your network or from third-party data that's integrated into the workflow, right? So it's becoming much smarter in terms of identifying exceptions, identifying potential fraud. To your point, invoking the workflow to the right person at the right time, which with a much better probability of that not being wasted time and effort for the employee, so they pay attention to it
Yeah.
and come to it with a heightened expectation that they need to act, or that there's something that's unusual about this request. I think that it's going to be a much more predictive and sensitive world in term rather than these rote, simple workflow, rules-based architecture to try to prevent the fraud.
Yeah, and I really hope, and obviously it's the big problem that we saw, and one of the reasons we built EVED, so is that it will become, you know, unacceptable to have all of these manual workflows, to have email approvals, to have
Yeah.
email payments, to have email vendor onboarding, and I really hope that it doesn't become that the way that really shifts for complete accepted, because I would say there's still very few productions and companies that are doing it with software and centralized, and most are still doing it this way. I hope it doesn't have to wait for some major like fraud and hit to someone before everyone's like, okay, we can't do
Usually,
that. Like,
sadly,
I know it
usually it
usually happens,
does.
but I hope that
Yeah.
that's not, and I really
Yeah.
hope that people, because it's scary. Like, I know we were doing this years ago before AI was, so now I look at it and it's like it's like as we say, it's one email away. It's like one, that until it, and you don't want it to be you. And so I think that to me is like something that I really hope in, just educating people about it and educating people to realize that the risks are so much more significant than they ever were. So thank you for sharing that and doing that with me. The other thing I think is that there's going to be like a combination of, as you said, as preventative, right? You can, your people, your process, your technology, your processes should be in a centralized system, nothing outside, not where you need to move, data from one to the other with any
Oh my God. Yeah.
intervention of an individual.
Yeah.
You really want to have that there's no control over that by an individual, and it's all really streamlined. That doesn't mean you have to use all one system. It means the systems you use they should be integrated in a way that secures that. And again, not everything has to have a formal integration. AI can do incredible things also now with integrations for those antiquated systems, which we have a lot of in this industry. But so I think it's the preventative and then in the process, but then I also think it's the reviews. So one of the things that I know we have is like reports that, hey, this is like a report, whether someone wants that on a daily basis or a weekly basis or however they want it, is like, these are just transactions that you should look at, right? So if you don't have the data centralized and you don't have something monitoring sort of what are the report you want, like someone could set up a report and say, I want to know all the transactions that were done to a vendor that we never paid before. I want to know all the transactions that were done to that were over $50,000. I want to know all the transactions that were done outside the United States. I want to know all the transactions that were to an individual versus a corporation. And you can ask all these, if you're like the VP of finance, or you're the head production accountant, or whatever it is that you are, whatever role you are, you're the CFO, and you want to see it aggregate across your organizations, to be able to set up sort of your own parameters as to what you want to be kind of notified in a report, not necessarily like individual notifications, but a daily report, a weekly report, a monthly report, whatever you want. To me, I think that's also like something that is really powerful going forward.
Yeah. And I think increasingly the CFO or the CEO or whoever they're just going to go into a chatbot environment that's connected to EVED or to the application and ask. Maybe they'll go into EVED, but maybe they'll go into the chatbot and just say, "Show me the reports from that I ought to be, show me the suspicious transactions for the ones that you think are most suspicious over the last 30 days."
Yeah.
Right? Anybody in the pretty soon anybody in the organization is going to have access to your system or underlying systems to query them and ask those questions through Claude or
Yeah.
ChatGPT or whatever. It's just not going to be difficult.
Yeah.
So,
And making it simple and easy.
yeah.
That,
Yeah.
that is that's how we see it. Like that's
Yeah.
what, we've got a lot that we're doing to roll out in 2026. And a big part of that's going to be just a voice prompt of tell me what, like, and this
Exactly.
is what I want to see. And it pulls it, and no more of that searching and
Yeah,
all
and
that.
trying to deal with something that looks like Tableau and how do I set it up and all that. I
Exactly.
just
It's
can
going to be,
query it and just ask what I'm asking for and it'll give me the report.
yeah.
Right.
So it's
Yeah.
just like, there's really going to be like these, really significant improvement in measures to be, but it needs to start with obviously being on a centralized system, because if you're
Yeah,
doing
you
all
got to
your email, you're not going to be able to take
yeah, you
advantage.
got to have the underlying data. Yeah.
Exactly.
Has to be organized.
So Okay. Well, Bob, thanks so much for having this conversation with me. It was a lot of
Sure.
fun. I really
Agreed.
appreciate it. Always love your insights and your experience.
Likewise. Thank
Always
you.
good to talk to you.
Yep. Good. Take care.
Thanks, Bob.
See ya.